What you are about to hear is not a polished political statement or a rehearsed interview. It is a raw conversation unfolding in real time, where questions about survival, safety, and truth collide with the reality of an entire nation living under constant pressure. At the center of it all is a simple opening question that often gets ignored in such discussions. How are you doing? And what does daily life actually feel like on the ground? The guest responds calmly, almost matter-of-factly, saying he is well, and that life continues despite everything surrounding the country. There is an expectation from the outside that life must feel constantly unstable, but he describes something more complex. There are warnings of possible major military escalation in the coming hours or days, yet people continue with their routines. Life does not stop, even under the weight of long-term sanctions, economic strain, and political tension that has lasted for decades. He explains that inflation has increased, some jobs have been lost, and there has been damage to infrastructure, including industrial and pharmaceutical facilities. Still, the picture he paints is not one of collapse, but of endurance. Even after years of what he calls maximum pressure, daily life in the capital continues. The city of Tehran, he says, still functions in a way that might surprise outsiders. It remains calm enough that people walk freely at night, even late hours, without fear of danger. In his view, it is in some ways safer than many Western cities he has experienced. At the same time, he acknowledges that life is not normal in the usual sense. There are gatherings happening across different neighborhoods, where people come together in visible support of the armed forces and broader resistance movements. These are not isolated events, but regular scenes in various parts of the city and beyond. Yet despite this political atmosphere, daily routines continue in parallel. Shops remain open, people go to work, and families carry on with their lives. What stands out in his description is this contradiction: a society living under geopolitical tension and economic pressure, yet still functioning in a structured and familiar way. From the outside, it might appear unstable, but from within, it feels controlled, even resilient. The guest emphasizes that while conditions are more difficult than they were a few months ago, especially due to sanctions and economic restrictions, life has not reached the breaking point that outsiders often assume. He suggests that this difference between perception and reality is important. To understand the situation, one must separate media narratives from lived experience. The city is not in chaos. It is not collapsing. Instead, it is adapting slowly, adjusting to long-term external pressure while maintaining internal order. That sets the foundation for everything that follows in this conversation, where the discussion begins to shift from daily life into the larger political forces shaping it. And as the conversation continues, the focus moves away from personal conditions and toward a much broader question. What forces are shaping these conflicts from the outside, and how should people in the West understand their role in them? The conversation shifts into more politically charged territory as the focus moves from daily life to global responsibility and the role of Western societies in ongoing conflicts. A key question is raised: what can people in the West actually do if they want to help, and where does responsibility begin? The response is direct. The most important step, he argues, is for people to stand firmly against what he describes as systems of ethnic supremacy and political ideologies that support it. He connects this idea to Zionism, describing it as a central factor behind much of the suffering seen across West Asia and North Africa. In his view, these are not separate conflicts but interconnected outcomes of a broader ideological system. He recalls a recent public discussion where he challenged a well-known media figure multiple times about whether a state built on ethnic supremacy could be considered legitimate. The question, he notes, was not answered directly. For him, this silence reflects a larger pattern in Western media spaces where certain foundational questions are avoided rather than addressed. From his perspective, global outrage over events in Gaza last year created a shift. Mass protests in Western cities, he believes, generated pressure that influenced political decisions at the highest level. He refers to diplomatic moves and public messaging that followed, suggesting they were responses to growing public anger rather than independent policy decisions. Even so, he insists that violence and destruction have not stopped. He argues that what is often described as ceasefires or stabilization efforts does not reflect reality on the ground. In his description, military actions continue in different forms, and civilian suffering remains ongoing. Lebanon is also mentioned, with claims of continued strikes and destruction in civilian areas, which he says are often framed differently in Western media narratives. A key point he raises is the role of media framing. He argues that language used in reporting often sanitizes events, describing attacks in neutral or technical terms that obscure their human impact. This, he suggests, contributes to a distorted understanding among Western audiences, where the scale of destruction is not fully recognized. He also connects current tensions with Iran to its political position on these conflicts. From his viewpoint, opposition to genocide and military escalation is a central reason why Iran has become a target of increased pressure. He frames the situation as part of a wider pattern of geopolitical confrontation rather than isolated disputes. Despite all this, he emphasizes that public awareness movements have already demonstrated influence. Past protests, in his view, created enough pressure to shift political strategies, even if temporarily. That, he argues, is why public engagement remains crucial. As the conversation develops, it becomes clear that the discussion is not only about specific conflicts, but about how global narratives are formed, who controls them, and how public perception is shaped over time. And from here, the focus moves even further into regional escalation and expanding conflict zones. The discussion deepens as attention turns to regional escalation, particularly involving Lebanon, Gaza, and broader tensions involving Iran. The guest describes a pattern that he believes is not isolated incidents, but a continuous expansion of conflict across multiple fronts. He refers to ongoing violence in Lebanon, describing sustained military strikes that affect entire towns and civilian infrastructure. From his perspective, these actions are not accurately reflected in mainstream reporting, where terminology often suggests precision targeting. He strongly disputes this framing, arguing that the reality on the ground involves widespread destruction rather than selective strikes. He also addresses international incidents involving humanitarian efforts at sea, where activist ships attempting to challenge blockades were intercepted. He describes this as part of a broader pattern where such actions receive limited coverage compared to previous years, suggesting a decline in global media attention despite continued events. The conversation then moves toward Iran and its relationship with both the United States and Israel. The guest expresses complete distrust in ongoing negotiations, stating that previous years of conflict and violence have shown no meaningful effort to stop escalation. Instead, he argues, the situation has expanded rather than de-escalated. He describes what he calls a war by expansion, where direct military operations are combined with economic pressure and sanctions. In his view, this creates a multi-layered form of conflict that affects civilian populations as much as military structures. He argues that sanctions are not separate from warfare, but function as an extension of it, limiting access to food, medicine, and essential supplies. He also refers to past military confrontations, suggesting that previous large-scale attacks on Iran were repelled. From his perspective, these events have reinforced confidence in national resilience, while also increasing expectations of future escalation. He mentions the possibility of timing military actions during financial market closures, suggesting strategic planning behind such decisions. A key theme in this part of the conversation is siege warfare. He describes it as a long-term strategy aimed at economic exhaustion rather than immediate military victory. According to his view, the goal is to create pressure on ordinary civilians by restricting access to essential resources. Despite this, he argues that Iran has developed a level of resilience that differs from other regions under similar pressure. He believes this resilience has been underestimated by external powers. As the discussion progresses, the tone becomes more focused on interpretation of global strategy, media framing, and long-term geopolitical planning. And from here, the conversation shifts toward controversial narratives and claims circulating in international discourse. The conversation takes a sharper turn as it touches on controversial narratives, media satire, and accusations that circulate in political commentary. A question is raised about claims from Western media suggesting unusual or exaggerated allegations involving Iran, which the guest responds to with a mixture of seriousness and critique. He points out what he sees as contradictions in how different events are framed internationally. For example, he references incidents where places of worship have been damaged during military operations, arguing that such events are often underreported or framed selectively depending on political context. In his view, selective attention creates an uneven picture of responsibility and victimhood. He emphasizes that blaming entire populations or religious groups for political actions is misleading and dangerous. Instead, he argues that responsibility should be directed toward political systems and state decisions, not broad communities. He is particularly critical of how complex identities are sometimes simplified in public discourse, leading to confusion and misinterpretation. The discussion also touches on the impact of extremist actions being attributed to entire populations, which he argues fuels misunderstanding and increases tension. He insists that many individuals within affected communities themselves reject the actions carried out in their name. From his perspective, much of the confusion in global discourse comes from how information is framed and repeated across media networks. He suggests that narratives often become simplified to the point where deeper context is lost, and audiences are left with incomplete understandings of complex situations. He returns again to the broader theme of responsibility, arguing that political decisions at the state level should not be conflated with the beliefs of entire populations. This distinction, he believes, is often ignored in public debate. As the conversation continues, the focus begins to shift away from specific accusations and toward a larger question: how information spreads, how narratives form, and why public understanding often becomes fragmented in highly politicized environments. The conversation now moves into a deeper reflection on how global perception is shaped, particularly through media systems, economic structures, and long-term ideological influence. The guest begins by addressing a central question: how is it possible that so many people remain unaware or unconvinced despite constant exposure to graphic events and widely available information? He argues that the answer lies in the structure of global media and economic power. In his view, wealth and political influence are deeply connected, and this concentration of power shapes what information becomes visible and how it is interpreted. He suggests that media institutions, academic environments, and policy think tanks often operate within the same broader system of influence. According to his explanation, this system does not only affect Western countries, but also extends globally, as many regions rely on Western-produced information, translations, and academic materials. As a result, narratives created in one part of the world can quickly spread and become dominant elsewhere. However, he also notes that this structure is beginning to change. Economic shifts and the decline of traditional power centers have led to increased questioning of established narratives. At the same time, the rise of digital platforms has allowed alternative sources of information to circulate more widely, even if they are still subject to censorship and control. He emphasizes the role of recent global events, particularly large-scale humanitarian crises, in accelerating public awareness. According to him, repeated exposure to such events has created a gradual shift in perception, especially among younger generations who are more active on digital platforms. He describes this process as a slow but steady transformation, where each new event adds to a growing sense of awareness. Over time, this accumulation of information has made it harder for official narratives to remain uncontested. At the same time, he warns that attempts to control or suppress information have intensified rather than relaxed. In his view, this creates tension between increasing public awareness and efforts to maintain narrative control. As this part of the discussion closes, the focus moves toward a more personal reflection on how individuals process constant exposure to global conflict and suffering, and what role culture and expression play in coping with it. In the final part of the conversation, the tone becomes more personal as the discussion turns toward art, comedy, and emotional coping in the face of ongoing global crises. The guest is asked about how he manages stress and whether he engages with any form of entertainment or artistic expression. He responds honestly, explaining that over the past years, his daily life has become heavily shaped by political and humanitarian events. He describes being constantly engaged with information, often checking updates and responding to developments throughout the day. This has significantly reduced his time for traditional entertainment. He admits that he rarely watches television or mainstream entertainment content anymore. Instead, his attention remains focused on ongoing global events, particularly humanitarian crises that he finds difficult to disengage from. He describes a sense of emotional burden that comes from continuous exposure to distressing images and reports. Despite this, he acknowledges the importance of art and comedy as tools for understanding and coping with reality. He expresses appreciation for satire and political humor, noting that such forms of expression can help people process complex and painful subjects in ways that are both accessible and meaningful. He reflects on how comedy can serve as both education and relief, helping audiences engage with difficult topics without becoming overwhelmed. In his view, art plays a critical role in maintaining emotional balance in a world filled with injustice and conflict. He concludes by emphasizing that even though he is deeply absorbed in serious global issues, he recognizes the value of creative expression and those who use it to raise awareness. He expresses appreciation for the interviewer and others who use satire to communicate complex realities. The conversation ends on a note of mutual respect, with gratitude expressed for the opportunity to discuss these issues openly. Despite the heaviness of the topics covered, there is a shared understanding that dialogue, awareness, and expression remain essential tools in navigating an increasingly complex world.